Let's talk about white privilege for a few moments. White privilege is a term that I've never really liked, simply because in where I was reared, white people certainly were not privileged. They were not rich. They struggled. They worked hard. So to suggest to the majority of them that they were somehow privileged is a non-starter in a conversation. So I always viewed the concept of white privilege as a non-starter in building bridges between white people and people of color, because it would immediately put off the discussion among white people. And I have to admit, I still have some reservations about the whole concept of white privilege, and that may be an example of me being a privileged white man. But I do want to talk about the concept of white privilege because in the last 2 or 3 weeks, in having many conversations on social media and private conversations, I've become convinced that white privilege is real. There are many privileged white people with whom I've had conversations that have demonstrated the reality of white privilege. Now let's talk about this. White privilege, a definition of white privilege, is inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So white privilege would mean that I'm not afraid to be pulled over by the cops. White privilege would mean I walk into a grocery store and I'm not concerned that people are following me. It can express itself in many ways. But let me address the thing that has most concerned me in the last 2 or 3 weeks, that has convinced me that white privilege is a very real enemy in the church. And that is the lack of empathy among white people for people of color. The lack of empathy. The unwillingness to have a conversation in which we are willing to listen, in which we are willing to try to identify, try to understand what our brothers and sisters of color are trying to tell us. The concept of empathy means that we're willing to pay full attention to the other person and take time to understand what they're saying and how they are feeling. You always try to put yourself in the other people's shoes in a meaningful way. Too many conversations in which I've been engaged, the majority of the white people are not interested in hearing the other side. They're simply interested in proving why the other side is wrong. That is an utter lack of empathy. When I see a privileged white man suggest to a black man, you shouldn't talk about race in the church, that is an utter lack of empathy. When we are watching black people struggle, people of color struggle for basic civil rights, and we don't care, that is an utter lack of empathy. We saw this during the election of 2016, when many white people had an utter lack of empathy for immigrants coming to the United States. All we could talk about, or all that could be said, was they're illegals, they're criminals. There was never empathy for the lives they were living south of the border. There was never an empathy for why they were coming to the country, the suffering they were enduring. So to me, what has convinced me these last 3 or 4 weeks of the evils of privileged white people is that we lack empathy. We lack compassion. We lack the most basic virtue of the Christian faith. That is love. Love which is self-denying. Love which is self-giving. Love that represents the gospel of Jesus Christ. If we don't want to be considered white privileged, then maybe we need to open our hearts.